John had spent decades away, serving his country, building a career, and navigating the twists and turns of life. But through it all, one thing remained constant: his love for his family's land. It wasn't just a property. It was the heart of his childhood, the place where his grandfather taught him how to fish, where his father built a small wooden cabin with his own hands, and where every sunrise felt like a promise of a new day. Now, after years of hard work, John was finally ready to come home. His dream was simple: to retire in peace, to reconnect with a land that had always been his sanctuary, and to honor the legacy of the generations before him. The drive back was filled with anticipation, memories flooding his mind like an old film reel, long summer days exploring the woods, the laughter of family gatherings, and the quiet, unwavering strength of his father's voice reminding him, "This land will always be yours, son. Protect it." But as he pulled onto the dirt road leading to what should have been a familiar sight, his heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. The towering oak tree near the entrance was gone, replaced by a modern metal gate. The winding path that once led to his childhood home had been paved over, smooth and unfamiliar. And beyond that gate, where there should have been open land, there were buildings. Not just one, but several houses, neatly arranged, too new, too perfect. John's hands tightened on the steering wheel, a sinking feeling clawing at his gut. This wasn't the homecoming he had imagined. This was something else entirely. John stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching against the gravel, his eyes darting across the land that was supposed to be his. Everything felt off. The air was different, not the quiet, untamed wilderness he remembered, but something controlled, sterilized. As he walked forward, he could see people moving about, strangers, laughing, drinking coffee on porches, walking dogs along newly paved sidewalks. It was surreal. He approached the first house, his heart pounding. Knocking on the door, he half expected his father to answer, as if this were all some bizarre dream. Instead, a man he had never seen before swung the door open. He was in his mid-40s, well-dressed, the kind of person who looked like he belonged in a country club, not in the middle of what used to be John's quiet retreat. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone polite but distant. John swallowed hard. "Yeah, I think you can. This is my land. Or at least it was." The man's brow furrowed, then his lips curled into something that was almost a smirk. "I think you're mistaken, sir. This is private property." John felt his stomach twist. "No," he said, his voice firm. "This land has been in my family for over 100 years. I own it." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "No, you don't. It was sold 2 years ago. I bought this house fair and square. Maybe you should check your records." John's breath caught in his throat. Sold? That was impossible. He hadn't signed anything, hadn't even considered selling. The land was his inheritance, his bloodline. Panic surged through him as he turned away from the house, scanning the land, his land, now occupied by people who had no idea they were living in the middle of betrayal. He had to find answer. John's truck roared down the road as he made his way to the county clerk's office. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. There had to be a mistake, a clerical error, some kind of mix-up. He had never signed over his land, so how could it possibly belong to someone else? The moment he stormed into the office, the clerk behind the counter looked up, startled by the intensity in his eyes. "I need to see the records of my land," he demanded, slapping his ID on the counter. The clerk hesitated but nodded, typing into the system. A few minutes later, she slid a folder toward him. John's pulse hammered in his ears as he flipped it open. And there it was. A sale agreement, a signature, his name. His stomach dropped. He had never seen this document in his life, yet there it was, stamped, approved, and filed away like it was a truth. He turned the page, looking for the buyer's name, and then his blood ran cold. Mark, his childhood best friend, the man who had promised to look after the land while John was away. The same Mark who had sat across from him at their favorite diner years ago, laughing over old memories, promising, "Don't worry, brother, your land will be waiting for you when you come back." That Mark had betrayed him, sold the land behind his back, forged his signature, and walked away with the money. John felt like the air had been sucked from the room. His best friend hadn't just stolen from him. He had erased his legacy with a pen stroke. The drive to Mark's house was a blur. John didn't even remember getting out of the truck, only that suddenly he was standing on Mark's porch, his fist slamming against the door. When it finally swung open, there he was, the man John had once called his brother. Mark looked the same, yet different. Older, a little heavier. But it was the eyes that got John. They weren't the eyes of a friend. They were the eyes of a man who had something to hide. "John," Mark said, a fake grin spreading across his face. "Man, it's been a while. What brings you here?" John didn't waste time. He shoved the folder in Mark's chest. "Tell me this is a joke." Mark glanced down, and for a split second, there was something, fear, guilt, maybe even shame. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He sighed, shaking his head. "Look, John, I figured you weren't coming back. The land was sitting there, untouched, and You what?" John's voice cracked with emotion. "You decided it was yours to sell? My family's land? The place we grew up? How could you do this?" Mark rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact. I needed the money, and you weren't using it. You thought wrong." John's hands clenched into fists. "You stole from me, lied to me. For what? A quick payday." Mark exhaled sharply, his fake charm fading. "It's done, John. You can't change it." But he was wrong. John had never fought a legal battle before. He was a man of action, a man who believed in honesty and hard work, not courtrooms and paperwork. But this wasn't just about money. It was about honor, family, justice. He found an attorney, a tough-as-nails woman named Susan, who took one look at the case and said, "Mark is going to regret this." But the fight wasn't easy. The land was already developed, sold to people who had no idea they were living on stolen property. The developers had poured money into the project, and they weren't about to just walk away. Mark, ever the snake, tried to play the victim, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. He even had the nerve to offer John a cut of the profits if he just let it go. But John didn't back down. He dug into every detail, gathering evidence, tracking down witnesses, even reaching out to the notary who had approved the sale, and that's when he found the first crack in Mark's scheme. The notary remembered Mark coming in with John's paperwork, but something had seemed off. When shown the signature, she hesitated. "That's not the same handwriting," she admitted. And just like that, John had his first real piece of proof. The war had begun. And John? He was ready to fight until the bitter end. News of the dispute spread through town like wildfire. Some people immediately took John's side, shaking their heads in disgust at Mark's betrayal. Others, however, weren't so sure. Mark had spent years ingratiating himself with the community, donating to local businesses, attending town hall meetings, and making himself appear like an upstanding citizen. Many people didn't want to believe that he was capable of such deception. Mark wouldn't do that, some said. Maybe John just forgot he sold it. That statement alone nearly made John's blood boil. Forgot? How does a man forget signing away the very land that raised him? But the most painful part was the silence of old friends, people he had grown up with, people who once spent summers fishing in the same creeks, now hesitant to pick a side. Some were too scared of getting involved, while others saw no issue with what Mark had done. "It's just land," one man muttered. "Why fight so hard over it?" John wanted to scream. It wasn't just land. It was his family's legacy, his childhood, his future. It was proof that his father and grandfather's hard work meant something. And yet, it seemed like no one but him cared. That was, until one unexpected ally stepped forward, an elderly neighbor named Mr. Dawson, who had lived next door to the property for over 50 years. "I know your daddy," he told John, his voice steady, "and I know what Mark did ain't right. If you need me to testify, I will." Those words lit a fire inside John. He wasn't alone. Not everyone had forgotten what integrity looked like. That night, unable to sleep, John climbed into the attic of the old cabin, one of the only things still standing on the land that hadn't been demolished by the developers. He rummaged through dusty boxes, searching for anything that might help his case. And then, Beneath a pile of old tools, he found it, a weathered, yellowed envelope addressed to him in his father's handwriting. His breath hitched as he carefully peeled it open, his hands trembling. Inside was a letter written years ago, as if his father somehow knew this day would come. "John, if you're reading this, I hope it's because you've come home. This land is more than dirt and trees. It's where our family learned how to survive, where we built something with our own hands, and where we buried the ones we loved. It belongs to you now. But make no mistake, there will always be someone who tries to take it from you. The world doesn't respect legacy anymore. They see open land, and they see opportunity. But you, son, you see history. You see family. If anyone ever comes knocking, trying to take this land away, you fight. You fight with everything you have, because once you give it up, you'll never get it back. And if you ever feel alone, remember this, our family is still here, in every tree, in every creek, in every star above you." John sat there in the dim attic, staring at the letter, his father's words sinking deep into his soul. He had been feeling so lost, so exhausted by the fight. But now, he had his answer. He would not let his father down. Armed with renewed determination, John and his attorney Susan dug deeper into Mark's fraudulent sale. That's when they uncovered a major flaw. The notary who had signed off on the sale was no longer in town, having mysteriously left just weeks after the documents were filed. That alone was suspicious, but Susan wasn't the type to let things slide. She tracked the notary down, calling every connection she had until she found a woman named Linda living in a different state. When they finally got her on the phone, Linda was hesitant at first. "I don't want any trouble," she said. "I was just doing my job." But when Susan pressed, explaining the full extent of Mark's deception, Linda sighed. "I knew something was off," she admitted. "Mark was in a rush that day. He brought in a stack of papers, told me it was urgent, and that John had already signed everything but couldn't come in to finalize it. He pressured me to notarize it on the spot, said it was just a formality. I asked if I could speak to John myself, and he got angry, said John was busy, that I was holding up a business deal. I should have trusted my gut." That was it. The missing link. Mark hadn't just forged John's signature. He had coerced a nervous, unsuspecting notary into approving a fake sale. This wasn't just fraud anymore. It was a crime. Once Linda agreed to testify, the dominoes started falling. The county clerk's office, under pressure, reviewed the sale record again and found even more inconsistencies. The signature on the deed didn't match John's legal signature on file. The sale date had been suspiciously backdated. Even the supposed payment Mark received for the land didn't add up, as if he had laundered the money through a third party. And then, the final blow, one of the developers, realizing the legal trouble they were now facing, flipped. Mark told us he had full legal control over the land. The developer admitted. We never questioned it. He gave us documents. We thought it was legitimate. But it wasn't. Mark had tricked them all. Now, not only was John's lawsuit stronger than ever, but Mark was facing criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and real estate theft. The man who had once stood so smug, so confident that he could get away with it all, was suddenly backed into a corner. And John? He was just getting started. The day of the trial, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his once friendly face now hard and defensive. John, however, stood tall, his father's letter tucked safely inside his pocket, a silent reminder of why he was fighting. Susan presented the evidence with surgical precision, tearing apart every lie Mark had built. The false notary, the forged signature, the backdated sale. Every detail was laid bare before the judge. When Linda took the stand, her voice shook, but her words were clear. I was tricked into approving that sale. If I had known the truth, I never would have signed. Mark's attorney tried to spin the narrative, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that Mark had acted in good faith, that the real issue was bad communication. But the judge wasn't buying it. With every piece of evidence, Mark's world collapsed around him. When the ruling finally came down, the words felt like justice itself. The land was rightfully John's, and Mark was ordered to pay back damages. But more than that, the judge made it clear Mark's crimes would not go unpunished. Winning the court case was supposed to be the final chapter in John's fight, but the battle was far from over. The developers who had built houses on his land were furious. They had spent millions constructing homes, paving roads, and turning what was once a peaceful retreat into a modern community. And now, because of Mark's fraud, they were being forced to shut it all down. The day John returned to his land, legal papers in hand, he expected compliance, but instead he was met with resistance. Residents, people who had unknowingly purchased homes on stolen property, were angry. "Where are we supposed to go?" one woman shouted, her voice shaking with emotion. Another man, younger, fists clenched at his sides, stepped forward. "You think you can just kick us out? This is our home now." John's heart twisted. He wasn't the villain here, but these people saw him as one. They had been duped just like he had, lured into buying houses that never should have been built in the first place. But before he could explain, things escalated. A group of men, clearly not just residents, but people hired to intimidate him, blocked his path. One of them cracked his knuckles, stepping closer. "Why don't you take your little victory and leave?" he sneered. "You don't belong here anymore." The message was clear. They weren't going to leave without a fight. John had spent his life believing that justice always prevailed, that when you fought for what was right, good things happened. But as he sat on the hood of his truck that night, staring out at the land that had once been untouched wilderness, he felt hollow inside. Yes, he had won in court, but at what cost? The land was scarred beyond recognition. His father's old fishing spot had been bulldozed, ancient trees replaced by concrete sidewalks, and the tiny cabin where he had spent summers as a boy was now just a pile of rubble. He had fought for his land, but the truth was he would never get it back the way it was. The weight of it all settled on his chest, heavier than anything he had ever felt before. He pulled his father's letter from his pocket, smoothing out the creased paper. "If anyone ever tries to take this land from you, you fight. But if you win, make sure you still have something worth coming home to." John swallowed hard. He had been so focused on the battle, he hadn't thought about what came after. Now, as he looked at his damaged land, he realized something. The real fight wasn't just about winning. It was about rebuilding. John didn't expect an apology from Mark. A man like that, a man who could look his best friend in the eye and steal everything from him, wasn't the type to admit he was wrong. But when the court ordered Mark to pay back every penny he had made off the fraudulent sale, things started falling apart for him. The money was gone, wasted on luxury cars, bad investments, and a lifestyle he could never afford to begin with. And now, with no way to pay the damages, Mark was drowning. His once pristine reputation in town was ruined, and the people who had once laughed at his jokes, clinked glasses with him at the bar, and called him a friend, they disappeared the second his luck ran out. He was no longer the charming businessman. He was a fraud, a criminal, a cautionary tale. The final blow came when he lost his own home, the very house he had bought with the money from John's land. John never felt satisfaction in seeing Mark fall. It wasn't about revenge, but there was a lesson in it all. When you build a life on lies and betrayal, it will always crumble beneath you. For months, John worked tirelessly to restore what little he could. He planted trees where the developers had cleared them, hoping that one day the land would feel alive again. He found an old photograph of the cabin his grandfather had built, and he began rebuilding it, piece by piece. It wasn't the same, but it was a start. People in town, the same ones who had once doubted him, began showing up to help. Mr. Dawson, his elderly neighbor, donated wood for the cabin. A group of younger men, eager to learn carpentry, offered their time to help build. Even some of the former residents of the illegal development, **, the ones who had once been angry at John, **, came back, realizing he wasn't the villain they had thought he was. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. It was about healing, about proving that history, legacy, and honor still mattered. And with every nail he hammered into place, with every tree he planted, John felt the weight in his chest begin to lift. The land would never be what it was before, but it would be as again as the sun set over his reclaimed land. John took a deep breath, the smell of fresh-cut wood and pine filling the air. He had fought harder than he ever thought he could. He had faced betrayal, threats, and loss. But in the end, he stood where he belonged. He thought of his father, of his grandfather, of all the generations before him who had walked this land, protected it, loved it. He had almost lost it all, Not just a property, but his belief in people, his faith in justice, his trust in the idea that right would always win. But as he looked around, at the land slowly healing, at the faces of those who had come back to help him rebuild, he realized something. Justice isn't just about winning a court case. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It's about remembering that some things are worth more than money. Mark had tried to erase John's legacy, but in the end, he had only made it stronger, and that, John knew, was the greatest victory of all. Some people think land is just land, just dirt and trees. But to some of us, it's more than that. It's family. It's history. It's a promise from those who came before us. And sometimes you have to fight for it, because once you give it up, you might never get it back. Tell me, if you were in John's shoes, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever fought for something that mattered to you, no matter how big or small, this story is for you. Because in the end, the only thing standing between you and losing everything is the choice to fight back.